At 2:10 a.m. on May 14, 2008, a 19-year-old college student called his parents from a rural Minnesota road. His car was stuck in a ditch, but he wasn't hurt. The call lasted 47 minutes as he tried to find help in the darkness. Then suddenly, his voice changed. "Oh shit," he whispered into the phone. The line went silent for 10 seconds. When he spoke again, his last words were barely audible. "Oh shit." For 17 years, investigators have wondered what Brandon Swanson saw in those final moments. What was terrifying enough to make a confident young man whisper in fear, then vanish without a trace? The answer may be more disturbing than anyone imagined. May 14, 2008, Lincoln County, Minnesota. A landscape so flat and featureless that it seems to stretch beyond the curve of the earth. This is farming country. Section roads laid out in perfect grids, punctuated by grain silos and farmhouses, separated by miles of empty darkness. At 2 a.m., these roads become something else entirely. No streetlights pierce the agricultural darkness. No traffic disturbs the silence. Cell phone towers are few and far between, leaving dead zones where modern technology simply cannot reach. The night Brandon Swanson disappeared, conditions were deceptively calm. Clear skies, temperature in the mid-50s, virtually no wind. Perfect visibility that should have made navigation simple for anyone with basic knowledge of the area. Brandon was driving from Canby, population 1,795, where he had attended an end-of-semester party at Minnesota West Community College. His destination was Marshall, just 30 miles southeast, where he lived with his parents in a modest home on the edge of town. It should have been a routine drive on roads he'd traveled hundreds of times. Instead, somewhere in the maze of identical gravel roads that crisscross Lincoln County, Brandon Swanson would encounter something that defied explanation, something that would make him disappear as completely as if the Minnesota prairie had simply swallowed him whole. Brandon Victor Swanson was the kind of young man who seemed destined for success. At 19, he stood 6 feet tall with an easy smile and the quiet confidence that comes from growing up in a close-knit farming community where everyone knows your name. He had been a 3-sport athlete at Marshall High School: football, basketball, and baseball. Not a star, but reliable. The kind of player coaches could count on to show up and give his best effort. His teammates described him as solid and the guy you'd want watching your back. Brandon was finishing his first year at Minnesota West Community College, studying wind energy technology, a growing field in a state where wind farms were beginning to dot the prairie landscape. He maintained good grades while working part-time at a local farm implement dealership. But perhaps Brandon's most defining characteristic was his relationship with his parents, Brian and Annette Swanson. In an age when most teenagers couldn't wait to escape their small hometowns, Brandon called his parents almost daily. He included them in his decisions, sought their advice, and never missed a family dinner when he was in town. On May 13th, Brandon had attended an end-of-semester celebration with classmates. He wasn't much of a drinker. Friends would later tell investigators he'd had maybe 2 beers over the course of several hours. He was the designated driver for his group, responsible and careful as always. At 1:15 a.m., he said goodbye to his friends and climbed into his 1998 Pontiac Grand Am, a reliable car he'd bought with money saved from his part-time job. The drive to Marshall was one he'd made countless times, on roads he could navigate in his sleep. But on this night, something would go terribly wrong. At 1:54 a.m., Brandon Swanson's Pontiac Grand Am left the paved surface of Highway 68 and slid into a roadside ditch. The car wasn't damaged, just high-centered on the embankment, wheels spinning uselessly in the soft spring earth. At 1:54 a.m. exactly, Brandon called his parents. Brian Swanson answered on the second ring, immediately alert despite the late hour. Parents of young drivers learn to fear middle-of-the-night phone calls. "Dad, I'm stuck," Brandon said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "I went off the road near Lind. Can you come pull me out?" Lind was about 10 miles from Marshall, a reasonable location for Brandon to be driving home. Brian and Annette quickly dressed and began driving toward where they thought their son was waiting. But as the minutes passed, something became clear. Brandon wasn't where he said he was. Brian and Annette drove every road near Lind, scanning with their headlights, calling out their son's name. Nothing. The phone call continued. Brandon described what he could see: farmland, a few distant lights, no recognizable landmarks. He started walking, hoping to find a house or at least get to higher ground where he could better describe his location. For 47 minutes, the conversation continued. Brandon walked east along what he believed was a gravel road, his parents driving frantically through the countryside, all 3 of them growing increasingly frustrated and worried. Then, at 2:10 a.m., Brandon's voice changed. He had been walking for nearly half an hour, talking steadily, when suddenly he stopped mid-sentence. "Oh shit," he said, so quietly his father almost didn't hear it. 10 seconds of silence. Then, again, even quieter, "Oh shit." Brian immediately tried calling back. The phone rang once, then went straight to voicemail. Every subsequent call went directly to voicemail, as if Brandon's phone had been turned off or destroyed. Brandon Swanson had vanished in the middle of a conversation with his parents, in the middle of a vast, empty landscape where there was nowhere to hide. By sunrise on May 14th, Lincoln County Sheriff's deputies were searching every road, every field, every farmstead within a 20-mile radius of where Brandon's car was found. The search area was enormous, hundreds of square miles of identical farmland crossed by dozens of similar gravel roads. Search and rescue teams arrived from across southwestern Minnesota. Bloodhounds picked up Brandon's scent at his abandoned car and followed it for about 1.5 miles northeast, the direction he had told his parents he was walking. But here's where the case became truly bizarre. Brandon's car was found near Taunton, Minnesota, not Lind, where he had told his parents he was located. Taunton was 25 miles away from where Brandon thought he was. Somehow, a young man intimately familiar with these roads had become completely disoriented. The search area had to be expanded dramatically. Helicopters with thermal imaging swept over thousands of acres. Volunteers walked through fields of emerging corn and soybeans, hoping to spot any sign of Brandon or his belongings. The Yellow Medicine River runs through this area, a winding waterway with steep banks and deep pools. Search teams dragged the river, checked every bridge, explored every culvert. If Brandon had fallen into the water, his body should have been found within days. The search continued for weeks, then months. It became one of the largest missing person searches in Minnesota history. Over 600 volunteers participated. Every building, every abandoned farmstead, every grain bin was checked and rechecked. They found nothing. No clothing, no personal items, no sign that Brandon Swanson had ever existed. It was as if he had simply walked off the edge of the world. In Brandon Swanson's abandoned Pontiac Grand Am, investigators found the remnants of an ordinary college student's life. Each item painted a picture of the person who had vanished, but none explained what had happened to him. Item number 1. A stack of textbooks and handwritten notes from his wind energy technology classes. The notes were meticulous, color-coded, the work of a student who took his education seriously. The books were marked with sticky notes and highlighted passages, evidence of someone planning for a future he would never see. Item number 2. The car keys, still hanging in the ignition where Brandon had left them. The engine was off, but the battery was still good, the headlights still functional. If Brandon had been trying to signal for help or illuminate his surroundings, he had other options besides leaving his car and walking into the darkness. Item number 3. The phone records that would become central to the investigation. The 47-minute call to his parents was documented down to the second, but more intriguing were the calls that came after 17 missed calls from his parents, all going straight to voicemail, as if Brandon's phone had been immediately turned off or destroyed. But perhaps the most haunting evidence was what investigators didn't find. Brandon's phone was never recovered, despite massive search efforts using cell tower data to narrow the search area. His wallet was missing from the car, unusual if he had simply gotten out to assess the damage and plan his next move. Most disturbing of all, there were no signs of a struggle at the car, no blood, no indication of foul play. Whatever had happened to Brandon Swanson had happened away from his vehicle, somewhere along the gravel road where he had walked into the Minnesota darkness. The car held no answers, only questions that grew more troubling with each passing year. For 17 years, the case of Brandon Swanson remained one of Minnesota's most baffling missing person investigations. Search teams returned every spring as snow melted, hoping to find remains that had been hidden by winter. Private investigators offered theories. Psychics claimed visions. None led anywhere. Brian and Annette Swanson never stopped looking for their son. They founded the Brandon Swanson Search and Recovery Fund, organized annual searches, and pushed for legislation requiring immediate investigation of missing adult cases. Previously, adults had to be missing 48 hours before police would act. Then, in September 2025, a combination of advanced technology and old-fashioned detective work finally broke the case open. A team of researchers using ground-penetrating radar was conducting an agricultural survey for a wind energy company, the same field Brandon had been studying. They were mapping subsurface features that might affect wind turbine placement when their equipment detected an anomaly. Buried 4 feet underground in a field approximately 2 miles from where Brandon's car was found, the radar revealed what appeared to be human remains and metal objects. The excavation took 3 days. What investigators found would finally answer some questions about Brandon Swanson's disappearance and raise others that were even more disturbing. The remains were confirmed through dental records to be Brandon Swanson, but the condition and location of the remains suggested this was not an accident or a case of someone getting lost in the dark. Brandon had been buried, deliberately, with his cell phone, his wallet, and something else that changed everything investigators thought they knew about that night: zip ties. Industrial-grade plastic restraints that had been used to bind Brandon's hands and feet. The medical examiner's report was clear. Brandon Swanson had been the victim of homicide. He had been abducted, restrained, and murdered sometime in the early morning hours of May 14, 2008. The discovery triggered a massive reopening of the case. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was called in. Cold case investigators began re-examining every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every theory that had been dismissed over the years. And they found something that had been missed for 17 years, something that suggested Brandon Swanson's final words had been exactly what investigators should have focused on from the beginning. Based on the physical evidence found with Brandon's remains and advances in cell phone tower analysis, investigators now believe they understand what happened on that May night in 2008. Brandon's confusion about his location wasn't the result of getting lost on familiar roads. Someone had deliberately misdirected him, possibly by moving road signs or using other methods to disorient him in the darkness. The 47-minute phone call with his parents inadvertently provided Brandon's killer with crucial information: exactly where he was, which direction he was walking, and when he would be most vulnerable. Someone was listening to that conversation, someone who used the information to intercept Brandon along his walking route. The location where Brandon's remains were found was not random. It was carefully chosen, far enough from roads to avoid detection, but accessible to someone with local knowledge and the right equipment. The restraints found with his body suggest this was not a crime of opportunity. Someone had come prepared to abduct and kill, someone who had planned this carefully and had the means to bury a body where it would remain hidden for nearly 2 decades. The FBI's behavioral profile suggests Brandon's killer was someone local, someone familiar with the rural road system, someone who understood the search patterns law enforcement would use, someone who could move freely through the area without attracting suspicion. In 2025, investigators identified a suspect, a local farmer who had participated in the original search efforts and had offered comfort to Brandon's family. DNA evidence found at the burial site, combined with cell phone records from 2008, led to an arrest. The suspect had used his knowledge of farming equipment and burial techniques to hide his crime. He had exploited the community's trust and his own apparent concern for the missing student to deflect suspicion for 17 years. Brandon's final words, "Oh shit," weren't the confused utterances of someone lost in the dark. They were the last words of a young man who realized he was in mortal danger. Today, the rural roads of Lincoln County, Minnesota, look exactly as they did on May 14, 2008. The same endless horizons, the same geometric precision of agricultural life, the same trusting communities where neighbors help neighbors and strangers are welcomed. But something has changed. The discovery of Brandon Swanson's remains has shattered the illusion that evil announces itself, that predators look like monsters instead of helpful neighbors. Brian and Annette Swanson finally have their son back. They can finally say goodbye, finally have a place to visit, and remember the young man who should have had decades of life ahead of him. The case reminds us that modern technology, cell phones, GPS, instant communication cannot protect us from the oldest human evil, the desire to harm others for reasons that make sense only to the disturbed mind that conceives them. Brandon Swanson was 19 years old when he died. He would be 36 now. Possibly married, maybe with children of his own. Instead, he remains forever young in the memories of those who loved him and in the case files that finally brought his killer to justice. In the end, Brandon's final words weren't about getting lost in familiar territory. They were about encountering something far more dangerous than the Minnesota darkness. They were about meeting a human monster who had been hiding in plain sight,